All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Jonna McEntee, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Museums Association. I want to thank you all for joining us for the OMA webinar, Volunteers in the Time of COVID. I'm so glad that you're able to be with us. We have a great program for you, and I want to get right to it. A few housekeeping items first. To help eliminate any background noise while our speakers are presenting, we do ask that you please keep your microphone muted and refrain from using your camera. We do have a chat box available in your settings bar. It's the little speech bubble symbol. And I want to encourage you to post any questions or comments that you have in the chat box during the session, and we'll have time to address those questions throughout the presentation, as well as during the Q&A time at the end of our webinar. This session is being recorded, and I'll put the link to that recording. The link will be available on the OMA workshop resources page, and I'll put that link in the chat box. The link will also be sent to you after the session has concluded, along with the evaluation for this session. There's a lot to cover today, so without any further ado, I want to introduce today's presenters. Sharing their expertise with us today is Jenny Woods, Assistant Manager of Volunteer Programs at the Seattle Art Museum and the President of the American Association for Museum Volunteers, and Marne Bariso, Volunteer and Intern Manager at the Chicago History Museum and a Midwest Regional Director on the board of the American Association for Museum Volunteers. Jenny has 19 years of experience working with volunteers in museums, both large and small, in urban and rural settings, nationally and internationally. She holds a master's degree in museum studies and is certified in volunteer administration. Marne has worked in museum education for nearly 30 years. In this position, she oversees the organization's general volunteer and internship programs and spends most of her time managing the docent gallery interpreter. So lots of great experience on the session today. I will be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation, like I said, so please don't forget to type in your questions. But for now, Marne and I will turn off our cameras because I know Jenny has a lot of great information for you. So Jenny, I'll let you dive right in.
Great. Thank you, Jonna. Everyone bear with me for half a second here while I figure out screen sharing and all of that good stuff. And now I want to, sorry, here we go. Play from the start. There, hopefully that is working. Everyone can see my screen and my slides, which help me stay on track. Thank you so much for having me with you here today. I'm delighted to be able to chat with you, although this topic is not the most fun thing I've ever presented about, because COVID is not the most fun thing we've ever experienced, but here we are nonetheless. So Jonna did a great job introducing us. I don't need to go over the details too much anymore. I will just mention, during non-COVID times, I am the assistant manager of volunteer programs at the Seattle Art Museum. I am currently furloughed from my role at SAM, like so many of our colleagues across the nation are. I certainly hope to be able to return there soon, but I just want to be transparent about that, something that I'm dealing with right now, and I know a lot of other people are experiencing that as well. And then I will just also mention, Jonna said Marne is the AMV Midwest Regional Director, and those of you joining us from Ohio, I believe Ohio is in the Midwest region. So Marne is one of your representatives. So nice to make that connection today. I would be a particularly remiss president of AAMV if I didn't just take half a second to tell you a little bit about AAMV and what we do. We are a professional organization devoted to supporting volunteer managers in the museum sector. We try to make sure we have useful resources for our members, whatever it is that volunteer managers in museums need, whether that's best practices, sample forms and documents. We do a regular podcast, a regular newsletter, there's a chat forum, all kinds of things available. And we do have a modest membership fee, $35 for the individual membership fee. But we also recognize that these are tough times for a lot of museums. So there is a waiver of that fee available if the $35 might be a barrier to you being able to participate in AAMV. So if you're not familiar with our organization, please check us out, aamv.org. Lots of great resources there available for you. All right. Whoops. Sorry, my screen is suddenly, there we go. It's having a little struggles. We're on it now. This is what we're going to be chatting about today. In particular, I have some details from a recent survey AAMV did of volunteer managers about volunteer engagement and what training looks like now, and just sort of what's going on, what have been the impacts of COVID on volunteer programs in museums. So I want to share some of those details with you. And then I'm going to go over some sort of ideas and suggestions and best practices and all those sorts of things. A lot of those were gleaned from the survey, but some of them are things that I've heard about or had conversations with folks about, or folks on the board have been participating in. So I've sort of pulled ideas from a few different places, although I will acknowledge the bulk of those are from that survey. We're also going to hear a little bit from Marne about remote interns at the Chicago History Museum. And then we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about what is coming next for volunteerism. I don't claim to have all of the answers, but best guesses about what's coming down the pipeline at us, and some things that you can do with your program. And then because that future section is a little heavy, I wanted to end with some silver linings that some folks from the survey provided about what are the silver linings for the pandemic. And as Jonna mentioned, we'll stop a couple times to do Q&A. And then we'll do a session at the very end. So feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll address those as we get to them, or we can do some at the end as well. Okay. So July 2020, AAMV did a survey of volunteer managers about the impact that COVID was having on their volunteer programs. July was only 2 months ago, but in COVID time, it feels like it was a lot longer. I think a lot of the information we gathered is still relevant. There's several things that I'm sure have changed since then for a lot of museums. But at any rate, we had about 82 people responded, which I thought was a decent response rate. You can see the breakdown here of the different types of museums that responded. So we had a lot of art museums and history museums that sort of made up the bulk of the respondents. And then, a nice sampling from other types of museums as well, science and technology, aquariums, cultural sites, more specialized museums. So that's the breakdown there. One of the questions we asked was, if they were open or closed at that given time. And this is one thing that I think definitely we would have different numbers if we redid this survey today, because I know a lot of museums that status has changed in the past 2 months. But in July, 46% of the museums that responded were open and 52% were closed. So nearly half and half. We also asked what the status of their volunteers was at that given time, and just under 70% of the respondents said that they had volunteers on leave at that time. Just under 30 respondents said that they had volunteers working remotely, and about the same number had volunteers on site. People could choose more than one answer there, and that's why that doesn't add up to 82 if you were trying to do that math. But the bulk of folks had at least some or maybe all volunteers on leave at that time. So the next question we asked, in the next 3 to 6 months, do you anticipate having fewer, the same, more volunteers than your pre-COVID number? And given that we had about 50% of museums say they were open, I thought this was a really telling answer, that 90% of the respondents said that they thought they would have fewer volunteers in the next 6 months. So that was really telling to me that such a strong response there, that people were anticipating not having their regular numbers of volunteers. 9% of people said they thought they'd have about the same numbers, and 1%, and given our numbers, that's really one person who thought they would have more volunteers in the next 3 to 6 months. We followed that up with the question, why? Tell us why you think you'll have fewer, the same, or more volunteers. And the answer that received, or the response we received the most was people mentioning that the age of their volunteers, or perhaps that their volunteers may be high-risk individuals, was one of the main reasons why they would have fewer volunteers. Another frequent answer we saw was people had limited volunteer opportunities, or they weren't doing tours right now, and tours was a major thing that their volunteers did for them. Other answers that came in, COVID would still be an issue, very prescient there. Volunteers waiting for a vaccine, fear of the virus, volunteers might be ready to retire. Somebody mentioned engagement as a reason why they wouldn't be able to have as many volunteers. Uncertainty about reopening, building capacity limits, and then recruitment difficulty were the other answers that were shared for that. The folks who thought their numbers might stay the same talked about the dedication of their volunteers. Maybe some of them had some horticulture opportunities they could switch folks over to and retain that same core of volunteers. And a few people mentioned having an influx of younger volunteers that was sort of offsetting the folks that were taking a leave. And the folks, or the person who thought their numbers would go up, said they needed more, so they were going to recruit more. So an optimistic soul perhaps there. So keeping your volunteers engaged, what sort of things did we see? And like I say, some of this is from that survey, some of this is from some other sources, some conversations I've had with folks. We recently had a virtual happy hour. There were some great ideas in a webinar that was just last week that Sterling Volunteers put out on volunteer engagement. If you didn't catch that one, I think it's on their website. But sort of gathered these ideas from a few different places. So one thing we heard a lot of people talking about was that they're holding online gatherings, but beyond the trainings and the meetings that are sort of the business side of their volunteer program. So some of the ideas that people mentioned here were, having an online book club with their volunteers. People are taking virtual field trips with their volunteers, which I love that idea, because the virtual side just takes the location. You can take a field trip anywhere in the country. You don't have to stick with someplace that's just an hour from your museum. Another creative idea I heard of was randomized coffee chats, where volunteers would sign up and say, yeah, I'll do a coffee chat. And the volunteer manager would then, pair up 3 or 4 folks who maybe didn't know each other, had never volunteered together, or volunteered in really different areas, and have a chance for them to get to know each other over a Zoom coffee chat. I was thinking like, oh, that sort of replicates the coffee break we have often during our trainings, or the social half hour before the presentation starts. But I think this might actually be even more randomized, because it forces people to not just talk to the volunteers they already know. It gets them actually connected with new folks that they maybe haven't talked to before. A lot of folks are switching volunteers over to some remote projects, and there's been some really creative and I would guess in many cases new projects that people have been able to find for volunteers to do. A lot of museums have been talking about having volunteers help with some collections-based projects, like archiving, cataloging, updating sections of the objects database. Some people mentioned having their volunteers reviewing online programming before those things were going public, as we were all switching to this new model. Updating volunteer handbooks and trainings, getting volunteers involved with that work, which maybe they wouldn't do otherwise, but this was a nice chance to look at that. Having volunteers act as virtual speakers or presenters in classrooms. I know a lot of people are sort of switching to that model, while most of us don't have any sort of field trip options going on this year for school groups. I think a lot of folks are also rethinking what volunteer roles could be, should be, can be at their museum. And I think as folks are sort of looking at, okay, well, usually our volunteers, a lot of them do customer service roles, and that is not a role that works for a lot of places right now. So what are the museum's new needs? Maybe they're interim needs, maybe they're going to last forever, who knows? But turns out something that pretty much all museums need is fundraising. None of us are sitting here going, oh, we're very, very flush with cash right now. But several folks mentioned switching volunteers over to help with their development department and fundraising projects. And maybe that's not something that they did prior to this, but it's a good chance to get volunteers engaged and involved with where the museum's true needs are. And then I mentioned before, some folks had been successful at switching their volunteers over to maybe some gardening opportunities or some outdoor festival things. So just making some of those changes where they can. A few folks mentioned being able to really engage their volunteers in diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility work that maybe they'd been slowly chipping away at prior to this, and suddenly they really had time to get people really involved in depth in this project. And that's, I think, a wonderful use of volunteer time, a wonderful way of getting volunteers invested in that sort of work. We've heard a lot of people mention this is the time to really relax those rules and regulations around volunteer commitment. And this is not the time to be punitive about if somebody takes more than 2 sick days in a given month, or how long somebody can be on a leave of absence from their volunteer role. So hopefully you're doing that as well. One museum had a sort of a creative idea of giving their volunteers credit, like hours, if they volunteered for a crisis-based organization during this time instead of for their museum. So if their volunteers were delivering groceries for seniors instead of volunteering at the museum, they could count those hours towards their museum hours. Sort of an interesting way of thinking about the requirements and hours and all of those things that we're always pushing for our volunteers and always tracking. And then, of course, keeping your community of volunteers engaged. Keeping that communication flowing is so key. I always like to think of, whenever I can give my volunteers sort of the inside scoop of what's going on and share with them something before it's made public. And I think volunteers, are interested in that. They, you might not be as interested in the recap from the staff meeting, but your volunteers might actually be really interested in hearing some of those things. And I think sometimes we can forget that volunteers don't always get access to that information, especially when they're maybe not interacting in the same way they were before, if they're remote or they're coming in, but the staff is still working from home, or whatever the situation may be. So making sure people are keeping that communication flowing, sort of giving people the inside scoop whenever possible, is key. I think maintaining those annual traditions or events as much as possible, even if it's switching your appreciation event to a virtual event, or but if you have regular town hall meetings with the director and the volunteers, as much as those things can be maintained, it's sort of nice to sort of keep those traditions or those rituals in place, to help keep us all connected. And then symbols or tokens or swag. This is sort of the pandemic version of the volunteer lanyard or pin or buttons or vest or whatever it is that maybe your volunteers get as part of being a volunteer. And a couple creative ideas I've heard of. One museum dropped off yard signs for their volunteers. So I don't know exactly what they said, but I'm assuming something like, an amazing volunteer from such and such museum lives here, and the volunteers can decide if they want to display that or not. And another museum created custom Zoom backgrounds that they could share with their volunteers, something that was nicely designed from the design team, and specific to volunteers. So just some interesting ways, some attempts to keep people connected as much as we can, in this disconnected and distant world that we're in right now. And then I have one example of sort of a switching volunteers to remote programming and rethinking things. I know a few museums are doing this, where they're having a greeter volunteer, who's working from home, working remotely, and still maybe greeting the visitors in the lobby. So instead of the person behind the info desk, they've got a monitor there. And I assume this takes maybe an outgoing volunteer who's ready to sort of holler out at people as they walk in the door, like, hey, I'm live, you in the blue hat, hi, let me know if you have any questions. But I know a few museums are doing this, and I've heard good things so far. I think it's fairly new, and I think we're all sort of feeling our way through it. But I know the Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian Museum, is doing this, as well as the Museum of Flight here in Seattle is trying this. And I've heard from the Museum of Flight folks, and they said that volunteers like it and visitors seem to like it, and it seems to be working. So once again, takes the right set of circumstances, of right volunteer, probably right IT setup, but an interesting idea for keeping those greeter volunteers still working at their same role. They can give directions to the bathroom just as easily over the screen as they could when they were standing right behind that desk, I am sure. So kind of a fun idea there. Let's talk just briefly about what does training look like in this era. So most people are really doing virtual trainings for volunteers right now. A few folks mentioned that they were able to do sort of an in-person training if they, and this was in July. So weather permitting, they had an outdoor space, they could make it work. But I think most people are leaning on virtual trainings, maybe a hybrid option, depending on where they are. A few people mentioned the benefit of being able to record their training, that orientation, and then they just have a recording of it and they could use it, forever. And I acknowledge that is a benefit, but I would still really encourage people to offer live or synchronous training options. I think we all know the difference between watching, even if you're watching both on a screen, but watching something live and being able to interact and ask questions versus watching a recording of something. So I think it is great to have that in your back pocket, to have that recording, but whenever possible, holding live trainings and orientations, or whatever the case may be, I think is the best policy still. And then, just people have talked about making sure that you're adapting your training for this new format. Recognize what needs to change about your presentation style, about your slides, when trainees are virtual. And it's, you really can't just take the same presentation that you've been doing in an auditorium or around a conference room for years and just slap it online. There do need to be some changes in the way that interaction happens. So taking those into account, I think, is key. I wanted to just highlight one museum and sort of what they're doing. So Newfields, if you're not familiar, they're in Indianapolis, and they're sort of, I don't know if they'd use this term, but a complex of different types of spaces. So they have the Indianapolis Art Museum as part of this, but I've thrown up their map here as the background of this slide. So you see, apparently they have 100 acres of a nature park, and there's a few other places that got cut off on the slide. All in this big park, for lack of a better word. So Newfields had the challenge that they are not doing remote volunteering opportunities. They actually are doing a recruitment right now for on-site volunteers for an outdoor harvest fest that they have every fall. So they needed to figure out a way to do a completely online or virtual onboarding for volunteers who are going to be working physically on site. And this is sort of the way they shifted things. So the process is the potential volunteer does an information inquiry on their website, then they get sent an online information video, find out all about the organization and the different volunteer opportunities. If that sounds good, they fill out the online application. The initial interview with the volunteer staff is virtual, one-on-one interview. And then the orientation is either one-on-one or maybe small group, but a virtual orientation session, so that all of that onboarding happens really before the volunteer physically comes on site for their shift. So the folks at Newfields said that they really wanted to focus on educating these candidates about the institution, about what they would be doing as a volunteer, and really be clear about their pandemic response measures so that they could make sure people felt really comfortable with this process of like I say, online onboarding, on-site volunteering, and how that happens, and keeping everybody informed and also safe. So sort of an interesting little case study there from Newfields. I think if Jonna, if there are any questions that have rolled in, I think this might be a good spot. We can address any of those.
No questions yet. Everyone is enthralled with all of this great information. So just a reminder, if you do have questions for Jenny or Marnie, make sure that you put those in the chat box and we will address them at the next stopping point.
Yes. Well, I think next up is I'm going to turn it over to Marnie. Marnie, if you just want to let me know when you want me to cue forward the slides, I'll be your slide girl, and we'll go from there.
Gotcha. Thank you, Jenny. I learned a number of things too, even though I'd looked at that survey already. So thanks for your all your information. So I'm the volunteer and intern program manager at the Chicago History Museum. And, when things shut down in March, I thought, well, maybe we won't have a summer internship program. We usually have around 30 or so interns, which is a huge amount, a big amount, because we have only about 90 or so staff. But as the next, few weeks moved along, staff became creative, innovative about how they could engage interns remotely. So in the spring, I did some research and took a look at what are some best practices out there about for remote internships. And AAM put together a very informative, nice webinar about remote internships. It very well may be, I should have checked before I mentioned it, but it very well may still be available since it was recorded. And remote internships existed even before the pandemic. The Smithsonian did them, as a matter of fact, and not to mention some non-museum, businesses. So there are articles out there with best practices and tips. So, and I'm happy to say that we wound up with a surprising number of remote interns this summer, 28, which is nearly the normal amount. And I'm happy to say, after doing exit interviews with nearly all of them, that they had positive experiences. Granted, I think their expectations were appropriate. So yeah, that was really great. Hearing from all those interns, and I'm proud of all my colleagues who supervised them and did a great job. So Jenny, yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So some things that I learned over the course of the summer. What kinds of projects work best for remote interns? Well, those that have kind of task-oriented components where there are measurable milestones that you can hit throughout the summer. Research-based projects too are good. Interns, being college students, just about in all cases, are good at research. So that's another activity that is appropriate. In terms of program implementation, we did have one intern who worked with my colleague who pivoted like we all did and moved the public programs to a digital format. And she had an intern who was able to help her implement those programs. So I do have an example of that. Another tip is to put everything in writing. We already had an intern agreement. I revised that to reflect the aspects of the remote internship experience. But clearly we still needed that. Instructions for the project, if someone didn't necessarily have instructions in writing, now is the time to put them in writing. And then something came up when I met with intern supervisors just within the last couple weeks. Someone had an experience, kind of an awkward moment with an intern when the intern said, "You know what, I don't have time to do this next project that you're giving me." So that was unexpected. And an idea that we brainstormed is maybe there should be some sort of even a form or some process where weekly, twice a month, that the expectations for productivity are articulated so that there are no surprises, because we're all learning about our work styles, the interns in general, but let alone working remotely or from home or from the dorm room. So another top tip that came about from talking to interns at exit interviews consistently is to set aside specific work time for the projects. And this could be flexible. Their work time could be, 10 p.m. to 1 a.m., which I think addresses issues of accessibility and equity for those interns who might have to work and who otherwise wouldn't have been able to do an in-person internship. But to have those set hours, that was important that the interns found, and even setting aside a workspace and a routine to sort of get ready for your work time, which normalizes it in a little bit of a way. Also setting check-in times, that seemed to be a top tip from intern supervisors and the interns. I had an intern this summer and I checked in with her twice a week. It seemed like other intern supervisors, it was more like once a week, but that could depend on the nature of the project or the stage that you're in at the project. But I happened to do twice a week. And some of those chats don't necessarily have to be entirely about the internship activities. If you think about how we engage with interns when we're in our building with them, there are lots of these informal sorts of chit chats or conversations. So that's harder when you're just talking over the phone or over Zoom. So to be intentional about having those types of interactions with your intern, taking an interest in them, appropriately so, of course, but I think interns, many of them value that relationship, or the way they see an example of how peer-to-peer, colleague-to-colleague conversations can go that aren't work-related. And that also is an opportunity for you to sense if there are any issues or something's happening that you have to address in terms of the intern being working remotely, this situation in our world, that I think that comes through the less formal conversations. Okay, Jenny, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Another challenge when you're working remotely with interns is trying to keep them engaged and building intern community, which certainly is easier when we're all in our buildings together, or can be closer physically to each other. When we're in person, for example, at the Chicago History Museum, we do programs during the summer, panel programs with staff, walkthroughs of exhibits with staff. So we tried to do a little bit of that this summer, but there are also ideas that aren't that difficult, challenging. In fact, sometimes even easier than when you're in person. One is to ask the interns to make presentations about their accomplishments. This practices public speaking skills and other skills, and reminds the intern to reflect on their accomplishments, and also reminds whoever is listening to them, if you invite staff to these presentations, reminds them of the accomplishments of the interns. And some ideas for programs to plan for them, get to know the collections department, get to know the conservation department, where you ask staff just to talk a little bit about what's going on in the departments and so forth. Similarly, ask a curator, ask the president, ask an educator, where you get interns together on Zoom or whatever platform and do something like that. Also, you could have interns submit their questions beforehand and have the panel participants prep and answer beforehand, or arrange for interns to get together on their own without someone to facilitate. That is something that was suggested and kind of happened in one department. They were good about doing that with their own interns. We used Google Classroom as a way to help interns interact with each other. I have a daughter who just graduated from high school this spring, so she was able to help me in putting together help me with my Google Classroom skills. We asked our interns to post a mini biography or a short video about themselves on the classroom site. We posed discussion prompts on there. I also posed a question at one time to staff, like, what are your favorite blogs or books that you use for inspiration? And so I posted some of those responses on there. Someone else suggested Slack as a way. I'm not familiar with this platform. I know it a little bit, but I've never used it. Someone described it to me once, because a department at the History Museum was using it, but that could be an informal way for interns to interact with each other too. So I hope those are some ideas about doing remote internships. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Marnie. I just want to check in and make sure, are there any questions that are rolling in that Marnie can address about that while we're thinking about remote interns? All right. We'll continue to have opportunities for questions. And we will move along. So don't hesitate to type those into chat if you do end up having a question. All right. Whoops. There we go. So what is next for volunteerism? Well, I wish I knew, because I'd tell you for sure if I did. But I am not a futurist. I am not a fortune teller. I don't think anybody knows for sure what's coming next in our world. I am the sort of person who likes to, I like to look back for any sort of precedent that's happened that might help give me clues for how to deal with something. And the challenge right now is, of course, that there isn't a precedent for this in modern history. I guess I could have looked back at the 1918 pandemic and how that impacted volunteerism. But I'm not sure how much that would really apply to our modern times, and I'm not sure that data exists anyway. I didn't look. I'll be honest. I didn't look. But there's not really anything that truly can tell us what to expect related to volunteers as we struggle through this pandemic and hopefully come out of it in the next year, hopefully. But I did think that maybe there might be some lessons that could be learned from looking back at two events in the recent history, and have a slightly similar vein, and what impact those had on volunteerism. So I looked at the data of volunteer rates after 9/11 and in conjunction with the 2008 recession to see if that's helpful. Is it the same? Absolutely not. Does it maybe tell us something? I don't know. We'll look at it together and see if there's anything here. So Nonprofit Quarterly has been tracking the rates of adults, and they say adults are 16 plus, who volunteer in the United States since 1974. And this is not specific to museum volunteering. This is all different types of volunteering. And what they have found is that since 1974, the rates of people who volunteer has been decreasing ever so slightly every year. So going down sort of steadily, a little bit each year. And then we get to the years following 9/11. And post 9/11, suddenly in those years, 2002, 2003, 2004, we see a surge of people volunteering in their communities, maybe a sense of civic pride or wanting to reconnect with community, whatever it is, a huge surge. The number shoots up higher than it had been since Nonprofit Quarterly has been tracking this. Does it last? No, it doesn't last. 2005 is the peak, and then we start trending down again with people leaving volunteer roles. Then we have 2008 and the recession. And it's interesting if you read news articles from 2008, there are several out there with volunteer managers being interviewed and sort of anecdotally saying, oh, we're having a surge of people applying to be volunteers. All of these folks who are maybe been laid off are wanting to maintain their skills and beef up their resume a little bit, or they've got extra time. So I'm getting more applications than I've ever gotten before. It's a huge surge. So that's the reports in 2008. But when we look at the data, which we don't get until a couple of years later, the surge didn't materialize. And in fact, there's one study out of Europe. I don't know how much that is the same here, but the study in Europe found that while there was an influx of younger folks who were new to volunteering, who signed up to volunteer for those very reasons, maybe they were out of a job, looking to beef up the resume, that gain was offset by a loss of folks who had previously been volunteering, who stopped volunteering. And once again, the hypothesis is perhaps there was a change in the finances in their family, and they needed to take on a job where they had been volunteering previously or something like that. So the relative gains were not a surge. They were offset by the losses of longer term volunteers. So what does this tell us for our current situation? I don't know. Maybe we'll see folks, a surge of people applying to be volunteers because they're so excited to be able to get out of the house and go do something. I certainly hope that's true. Maybe we'll see folks who are, and I think we are already hearing from folks, once again, a little more anecdotally, that they are getting applications from younger people who might be in school but are doing school remotely and have this free time or are craving this personal connection. So we may see that. Will it last? Probably not. That's what the trend has shown us. But I don't know. I thought this was at least a little bit interesting to sort of look at what these major world events or national events, the impact they have on volunteer rates. And like I say, you can tell me in a couple of years if any of my predictions here actually came to fruition. But what are our best guesses for the future of volunteerism? So my best guess is that volunteerism will change. Now, spoiler alert, it was going to change anyway. But I do think the pandemic is going to speed up some of the change that happens within volunteer programs. So I think that who volunteers is going to change. I think what they do as volunteers is going to change. And I think how they do it is going to change. So I think, and a lot of other people think this too, this isn't just my opinion, by the way, a lot of people are predicting that remote opportunities will continue even once the pandemic is quote unquote over. I think that they won't continue at the same rate that we maybe have them now, but there are a lot of benefits that people are finding to having volunteers help out with a remote project that maybe it never would have worked, or people didn't think it would work to have volunteers help with the collections database work or adding alt text tags to images on their website or whatever it is that volunteers might be doing from home. But it turns out that actually is pretty helpful, and there's no reason why it can't continue, even when more in-person opportunities are available. And I don't want to discount the amazing opportunity for museums to connect with volunteers outside of their local area. Maybe you're in Ohio, but there's someone who's an enthusiast for the subject matter of your museum who lives in Arizona. And here's an opportunity to connect with that person and really bring that person into part of your volunteer group in a way that maybe we would have all been a little bit dismissive of before. So I do think the remote opportunities are going to continue beyond the defined time of the pandemic, whatever that ends up being. And I do think that the average age of volunteers is going to skew younger over the next few years. And I have to say, it absolutely breaks my heart to say that, because when I say that, I don't think about the pie chart of the demographics, and I think of the specific people that have volunteered at organizations that I've worked at that, were maybe older and for whom it may not be safe for them to return to volunteering for some time. And I think all organizations will see the loss of some of their maybe most senior volunteers who are just not able to return safely, or the intervening year plus, maybe between when volunteer opportunities are not available will change their circumstances, so they're not able to come back. And I hate saying that. I do. It hurts, but I do think that we're going to see that change, which once again was already going to happen, but this is gonna move up that timeline a bit for some folks for retiring from volunteering. And I do think that in conjunction with that, we're going to see some of those differences between the different volunteer generations and the norms that they bring to volunteerism. It will accelerate that change. That was going to happen anyway. I don't like to completely generalize that, baby boomers do this and Gen Xers do this, but I think we can all acknowledge that if you look at sort of the wide spectrum of generations, that they do approach things differently, and they like to be communicated with differently, and they're interested in different types of volunteer roles and different types of appreciation events. And I think that holds true. So I do think some of those volunteer norms that each generation brings in will transition maybe a bit more rapidly than they would have given if we had not had a terrible pandemic. Okay, so what can you do with your volunteer program, given there's so much uncertainty about the future? I think the number one thing that you can do is make your volunteer program adaptive. The webinar that Sterling Volunteers put on last week, the speaker used a phrase, I just love them, I'm going to borrow it. She said, be nimble and be bold. And I think that is the key. What can you make about, what changes can you make about your volunteer program that allow you to adapt to these new things that might be coming at us, whether that's remote volunteers or younger volunteers or people who want to volunteer differently than we did in the past, or different types of roles at your organization. Be adaptive. This is the time to make those changes. I think utilize technology. We are fortunate to live in a time when there is technology available, that I can speak to you from my home in Seattle. And like I said, I keep wanting to say this morning because it's still morning here for me, even though it's afternoon for you. And I think for a lot of us, and I was guilty of this too, we used a lot of excuses for why we couldn't integrate a lot of technology into our volunteer program. One was always the cost, never in the budget. And the other was, I don't think our volunteers will adopt that very, very readily. Turns out we're all very flexible and are able to do this. So I think utilizing technology going forward is a great thing that we can do. Rethink volunteer roles, and this might be short term and this might be long term. I guarantee that your museum has new goals that they are thinking about right now, and we're not just all plodding along on the old strategic plan from 4 years ago. There's probably an interim plan. Talk with your leadership, figure out how volunteers fit within those new goals. What sort of roles could we switch volunteers to really maximize the help the volunteers bring to your museum? This is my own personal tip. Use the pandemic to change, cancel, or rework parts of your volunteer program that do not work. And I want to preface this next statement by saying, I want to assure you that I love volunteers. I love them so much. I love the passion they bring to the museum. I love working with them. This is why this is my career. But my love does not blind me to their occasional faults. And I have worked in several museums, and I've talked to a lot of volunteer managers, and everybody has mentioned this. We all have that thing that we would really like to change about the volunteer program because it is outdated or outmoded or just needs to be changed or whatever about it. It drives us crazy. And every time we try to change it, there's a lot of pushback from some very powerful volunteers, and we never get around to changing it. This is your chance. Change it. Get rid of it. Change it up. Update it. Whatever you need to do. Blame it on the pandemic. Free pass. There you go. I hope we're already building a diverse volunteer corps, but this is a good impetus to do that. Making sure that your volunteer group includes folks of all different races, ages, genders, socioeconomic statuses, whatever that diversity we need to bring in. Make sure you have it. It makes your volunteer program so much stronger and makes you so much more able to be adaptive and to be bold and nimble. So make sure that's part of it. Be mindful of risk management. I wish we didn't live in a society that was particularly litigious, but we do. So it's important to look at those waiver forms and update your policies about if a volunteer can come in, how long it's been since they visited or flew on an airplane or had a fever or whatever the case may be. We all need to make sure that everything's shipshape from a risk management standpoint. And then, of course, center your volunteer program in professional standards and best practices. Originally, when I was putting this presentation together, I had a slide further up in the slide deck, and the title of the slide was New Best Practices. And as I was filling in details for everything else, I kept coming across that slide and being like, oh yeah, I got to figure that out. I got to figure out what to put there. And when I finally took some time to really wrap my brain around it, I realized that there's a lot of practices for our current era that I was already addressing in ways people were changing things about remote volunteering and all, those sorts of things that I've already mentioned, but that we don't actually necessarily need new best practices. If you haven't looked at the professional standards and best practices for this profession recently, I encourage you to do that. And I think they still hold true. I think maybe the way some of those things get implemented has changed, but I think that the best practices still stand. And if you're thinking, oh, where do I find these best practices? We have them on the AAMV website. And these are not behind the members paywall. These are available to absolutely everyone. We want everyone to have access to a list of best practices that they can incorporate. So do check that out if you haven't looked at those in a little bit of time. Okay, well, the future looks rough, but here are some silver linings. These are some quotes directly from the participants in the survey. So one person said, it's become even more clear how dedicated our volunteers are. They want to be here helping and are willing to do projects, to take home, to stay engaged. New younger volunteers are applying because they're sick of being bored and stuck at home. They're looking for something to do. One person said, we've had a larger participation in virtual meetings than on-site meetings. And this person mentioned that this has forced them out of the dark ages. They are embracing technology in very creative ways. An additional silver lining is that prior to COVID, I got a pushback from our volunteers on every little change. This allowed me to place these changes. Everyone accepted them as part of our COVID process changes. So I promise I didn't do that last comment, but it speaks to me. If you're interested in seeing the full survey results, they are on the AAMV website, aamv.org/COVID-19. There's a list of all of those, the long answers, as well as all the pie charts and all of that good stuff. And now, whoops, I keep having trouble there. I think we're ready to do some Q&A. And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so that we're not having to look at that. Oh, John, could you repeat? I couldn't hear you. Still getting nothing. Okay, I'm looking at the chat now.
Okay, can everyone hear me now?
Yay.
Oh, this is point and see, but if everyone can hear me, there we go. All right, yeah, sorry about that. There is a question from Pamela who says, I'm concerned with policies in regards to bringing volunteers on site to work. Has anyone created a written safety policy? Do you have volunteers sign waivers or some sort of acknowledgement regarding COVID?
I would say yes. I'm definitely seeing people have created waivers and specific details about what what volunteers need to follow. Like I say, is have they traveled recently, if they have a fever, or they had a cough, if they lost their sense of taste. I think a lot of folks are using the same policies that maybe are being created for staff. So if that's an opportunity, you can adopt that for volunteers. I'm not sure that we have an example on AAMV, but I will ask around and see if anybody has one that they could provide as a maybe a little template. So stay tuned on that. Maybe we'll try to get one of those up on the AAMV best documents section here in the next week or so. So I think that would be a useful thing for a lot of people to sort of see that language. So I'll look for that. But I think a lot of people are using what their staff policies are.
Great. A question from Emily from Marne. Did your museum provide laptops for your remote interns?
We did not. We are still distributing laptops to staff who need them. So it's kind of a baby steps idea, but I would love to think that ultimately we could. I suppose it would be easiest for interns who are remote in the area. But no, we did not this past summer.
And a follow-up from Jeannie is, were these paid or unpaid internships?
These were all unpaid internships. We did have one intern who was paid from his own program. And then we had 4 interns who were taking, at least 4, it might have been more, 6, at least 6 interns who were doing the experience in conjunction with a university class. But as a side note, I have some colleagues who are growing more uneasy about taking on unpaid interns. A couple of them have even said, I really don't want to take any interns that are unpaid or not doing this along for class credit. So that growing sentiment, I think, will just support the efforts at the moment by me and my boss, who's the director of education, to try and figure out what's a way to incorporate funding into our budgets or pursue grants, because it needs to change.
Right. Emma says, I really like all the suggestions to offer remote or virtual opportunities with volunteers and interns. I work with volunteers and interns at my organization, and while we are more than open to creating these kinds of opportunities, we're severely limited in our technology resources and the ability to even give staff remote access to their office workstations, let alone anyone who's unpaid. What are your suggestions for being able to convince staff leadership and/or organization boards of the importance of obtaining more remote access for volunteers and interns, even if there's a cost involved?
I mean, I wish I had the magic answer here, Emma. This is something I think everybody struggles with. I think, the best bet is to, maybe put together a little bit of a proposal of what volunteers and interns could do for your organization if only they had the access. And I think sometimes even like, looking at the rates of what financial benefit they might bring. There are fundraising projects they could work on. Anything like that where you can show that quantitative value, as well as maintaining volunteer connections to your museum, and what sort of loss it will be if you don't have any chances to connect with your volunteers for this long drawn out time, and how much loss that will bring. Is it going to work? I don't know for sure. I think that's sort of the best bet is can you demonstrate? And I think connecting with other peers that have managed to do this as some case examples, like museums. I don't know, some museum leadership, they love to know what other people are doing, and then feel like they're falling behind. So use a little bit of that peer pressure is my best advice.
Excellent. And Renee asks, how do I find out about setting up a virtual greeter?
Renee, I'm happy to put you in touch with the person I know well from the Museum of Flight. If you want to email me, you're welcome to do that. I will type my email into the chat right here, right now. And yeah, email me. Whoops, I can't spell and talk at the same time. I'm having a hard time. AAMVmembership1@gmail.com. Okay, there we go. That will get directly to me, and I'm happy to connect you with the the Museum of Flight, which I know has been doing this successfully. I don't know anybody at the Smithsonian specifically who's been doing it. I've just heard that they were also doing it at the Air and Space Museum.
Great. And I know we have reached the end of our hour, so that's a great stopping point. If you have other questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, I'm sure Jenny would be more than happy to help answer those. So you can email her at the email address that she has listed here. So thank you again for joining us today. Many thanks to Jenny and Marnie for sharing their experience with us. Before we end the session, I just want to remind everyone that OMA has several resource lists available at ohiomuseums.org, including reopen guidelines from the state of Ohio, as well as other COVID-related resources that might be helpful for museums. And again, those are available at ohiomuseums.org. And in Ohio, the coronavirus website is coronavirus.ohio.gov. It's the state website for information, guidelines, and public health orders. OMA's annual Virtual Advocacy Day, Speak Up for Ohio Museums Day, is happening Monday, October 5th. So be sure to watch OMA's social media and blog all day long for advocacy actions, tips and advice from seasoned advocates, advocacy messaging, and more. You can see more details at ohiomuseums.org. And just a reminder that OMA is currently accepting session proposals for our 2021 virtual annual conference. Our theme for next year is Museums Reimagined, Opportunities to Reflect, Recover, and Reinvent. And that's happening April 11th through the 13th. The deadline for session proposals is October 16th of 2020, and you can learn more and submit your proposals, as well as see a full list of upcoming OMA events at ohiomuseums.org. Thank you all again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day and take care. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Hello.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.